What's up, nerds? Welcome back to Create Your Character. I'm your host, Beck, and I'm back from the ether, ready to give y'all one more episode of Create Your Character, because I know that's what all of you were asking for. This episode isn't going to be covering a specific cosplay like a lot of my past videos. This episode is going to be focusing on a key skill that is very handy in today's cosplay world. Today, we're learning how to read and follow sewing patterns. I swear it's necessary, because you can't always find what you need online or in a thrift store, and so you kind of have to make do with something that you really don't want. I mean, even famous cosplayer Yaya Han has her own line of sewing patterns that you can buy in almost any craft store. But enough of my talk, let's head over to the drawing board.
Alright, so before we begin using the sewing pattern, let's take a look at the different sections, because that itself may be a bit daunting because you don't know exactly where to start. So this is the pattern I will be using. Lots of costume patterns will come with multiple garment patterns in one set. However, I'm only looking to make this skirt. So not really a complex mission that I'm starting out on. The back of the pattern will show you how many yards of fabric you will need for each garment depending on your size. It will tell you any other odds and ends you may need for the design as well, such as zippers, buttons, etc. And also show you what fabrics would be best for the garment you are making. For instance, mine gives a list of stretchier fabrics. Now, opening it all up, you will find a bunch of tissue paper style instructions that no matter how hard you try, you will never be able to get them back into the pouch the way that they were in there to begin with. It's not gonna happen, I promise you. Moving on. This piece of the instructions is going to tell you which cutouts are used for each piece. You'll notice they are numbered, so I'm just gonna circle the ones that I'm going to be using so that I don't accidentally cut out something I'm not gonna need. And then this piece of the instructions is going to tell you the best way to organize your cutouts to avoid a lot of fabric waste, so you can use as much of the fabric as possible. And then this piece down here is going to tell you the meanings behind different symbols and different terminology used within the directions. That itself is a lot to unpack, so we're just gonna go bit by bit through this section as we go along. Alright, so getting started, first things first, I'm finding which cutouts I will need and, well, cut them out. You'll see on each of these cutouts there are these lines. These indicate where you need to cut for your correct size. If you are still unsure of your size, I personally always like to cut to the largest size, and I can always downsize later. It's always easier to get rid of fabric than it is to put it back. After all your pieces are cut out, you're going to want to iron the cutout guides. This ensures the shape and size of your fabric pieces will be accurate to what the design actually wants, and not kind of this warped version of that. Now, we are ready to cut out some fabric. Going back to that initial page of instructions, we are going to want to point out some symbols that will help us with this step. So the first big one you'll see in lots of, if not all sewing patterns, is this arrow. This tells you the direction the grain of the fabric needs to go in relation to the cutout guide. To find the grain of the fabric, just tug a bit at the fabric lengthwise and widthwise. The direction that has a stiffer hold is where the grain line is, and that is what the arrow is talking about. However, it may be harder to tell when you're using stretchier fabrics, such as the spandex polyester blend that I'm using right now. So do it a couple of times and give it your best guess. So after laying out my guides, I see that my layout pattern mentions I need a double thickness. So that just means I'm going to fold the fabric in half in order to save time and cut out 2 pieces at a time. Now, to secure the guides to the fabric, all I'm going to be using is some clothing pins. And you'll see on the guides that it says to allow for a seam of a certain size. This just means to cut a little bit wider in some areas that you will be sewing together to make seams. You will also notice while you are cutting that there are these triangle markers. This is usually part of the pattern that might curve, resulting in a bulge of fabric after you sew everything together. So creating a notch in the fabric will alleviate that bulge. Now that all my pieces are cut out, we can get to sewing. And luckily, most patterns give pretty decent step-by-step instructions for sewing, but it can still be a bit confusing if you don't know exactly what they're talking about. So let's walk through that. So step 1, on my sewing sheet, it says I need to alternate. Spoon? No. I know. On my sewing sheet, it says I need to alternate my skirt panels and sew them together, creating seams. Remember when the guide told me to leave 3/8 of an inch available for this? So I'm going to gather around 3/8 of an inch after lining up my two pieces, press that together, and sew it together using a tight, straight stitch. My directions say I need to leave room for a clasp at the top, but I'm not going to be using one for this skirt. Despite it giving you exact instructions, don't be afraid to modify them however you wish. After I create my circle of fabric, my guide says I have to gather the top of my skirt. Now, it doesn't go into any more detail than that, so what gathering means is I'm going to create 2 straight loose stitches, secure them on one end with a pin and the excess string, and I'm going to push the fabric down those stitches so it gathers at the end. After evening it out, I'm going to go over the gathered bits with a tighter stitch to secure them in place. Also, please ignore that I skip multiple steps because I realized at the very last minute that I don't want that ruffly bit at the bottom because the skirt length that I'm achieving is already long enough with what I have, and I really don't care that it's not going to be ruffly at the bottom, so I'm skipping it, so I'm sorry. On to my next step, I see that I now have to attach the waistband or yoke to my skirt to cover up all this gathering nonsense. When you do this, make sure you turn the garment inside out so a majority of the sewing is kept hidden while you are wearing it. After that, I'm all done. Wait, hold on. Now I'm all done. And ready for the Renaissance Fair with my new homemade skirt.
Alright guys, that's it for this episode of Create Your Character. I hope you were able to learn a thing or two for the real world, and if you happen to use these tips to create a piece of your own, don't be afraid to tweet us at ZTVGoofingOff with the hashtag #CreateYourCharacter. Anyway, remember, my name's Beck, and I won't see you next time on Create Your Character. Back to the ether I go.